Hi, I'm City Manager Jim Drumm, and today we're going to talk about the code enforcement in the City of Brunswick. I often get asked why we have so many old neighborhoods with old blighted housing and some overgrown lots, and so the city's going to talk a little bit today about how we work on improving those neighborhoods and some of the mechanisms we've put in place. We're going to talk about our code enforcement officers, and we're going to talk about the partnership that we've formed with Glynn County in creating the Glynn Brunswick Land Bank Authority. So I'm looking forward to today's program. My first guest today is Bren White-Daiss. Bren is the Director of Planning, Development, and Codes. And Bren, you've been on the show quite frequently, especially recently.
I have. You know, the term planning, the field of planning is pretty all-encompassing, so I feel like I get to be involved in more of the day-to-day parts of the city, so I enjoy being on here.
Well, great, thank you. I know when an issue comes up, we often say, you know, as we look at these programs to schedule them, we say, well, what seems to be a hot topic this month? And sometimes it does come back to your department because it really looks at the future. And planning is looking at what are we going to do next, whether it's in transportation, like we talked about the comprehensive plan in the past, but today's code enforcement. And code enforcement really does have a tie to what we're going to do with some of the problems. Most communities have it. The county has code enforcement, but in our city, being an older city, I mean, we are one of the oldest cities in the state. We have a lot of old housing stock. And years ago, our population actually was higher than it is today. We've seen a lot of people move from the community. We've seen a little bit of reduction in our population since the 1970s. We have some housing that's abandoned. And so I guess part of the issues that we have is how do we address that? What can the city do? And I know that historically we've done a lot of work in code enforcement. That's usually where it starts. I think the owners of the homes, a lot of times we look into it, they're called heirs properties. We find that we have a home that someone may have passed away back in the 1980s, and then their children lived in the home, and then something may have happened to them, and now we're trying to track down who the owners are, and I know you have that challenge. So tell me about your code enforcement office. It's part of that's that second part, third part, planning, development, and codes. So tell me how you address that in the city.
Yeah, so we can start with my department has planning, development, and codes, the way that you described it, and code enforcement. In the past, we've had 2 code enforcement officers that have generally been reactionary. We have worked on a complaint basis and certainly move forward as we can on properties that we get complaints about. But I'm excited this year to have a 3rd code enforcement officer, which allows us to really move forward in the proactive approach of code enforcement. That allows us to focus on specific neighborhoods and areas all over the city that need special attention in code enforcement, and often that could mean just sending out a letter to the property owner telling them what violations they've got, and half the time that works, just sending out a letter. So I'm excited to be proactive this year.
Well, and you're right. A lot of times people, by sending the letter out, you'll get a good response. I mentioned a moment ago about heirs properties and things such as that. So we do have some cases sporadically through the city. You'll drive down, you'll see some very well-kept older homes, and then all of a sudden you'll see 1 or 2 that perhaps on a block that are either overgrown, or you're seeing the porch start to collapse. And I think people come forward and they wonder, why doesn't the city make them mow the grass every week? Or why doesn't the city, if the house needs painting, why can't we make them paint their house? And I think some people don't understand that under American government, we don't have that ability to say, okay, it's time to paint your house this year, or maybe the grass has reached a certain level in our codes. I mean, obviously, if it becomes severely overgrown, code enforcement can act. But I think that's part of the questions of how come we're not out there doing that. And
well, you talked about heir properties, and that's a great point to make. When we have properties that are not owned by that are technically owned by someone who has deceased, then we have to try and figure out, do the legwork and the title searches to figure out who owns the property. In some cases, no one owns the property. We have a couple parcels that we've done the research on, and it's just it seems to be a dead end.
So
no pun intended.
No pun intended. Well, and it's well taken. I mean, sometimes, well, like we mentioned, you'll have, if you do the research, you'll find there's homes with 18 or 20 grandchildren, some that may never even been to the property, and they're uncertain that they even have some ownership stake in it, and don't want to step out of one of 18, so legally we're kind of caught.
Exactly.
And that doesn't mean you can't do anything. Sometimes if it needs to be secured or it needs to be torn down, there is court action that can be taken. So let's say we get to a case like that, and I know we have a couple of cases you could look at, but let's say you have a house, and I know on MLK we had a couple of homes like that last year,
Yes.
probably down just south of London Street. And we took it forward to the court. The homes were in very bad condition, and they gave a court order to have the homes torn down.
So that's a long process, unfortunately. But we've actually put some tools in place recently to make that process shorter, which is awesome. And in that case, we had to send out letters and do our due diligence as to the last known owner of the property. Then we had to do title searches on the property so that folks who are professionals in titles and deeds went through the searching to figure out if someone else now owns the property, who that might be. And then we got to a point where we could take it to court and tell the judge, we've done all this work, we've researched all that we can, and we can't find anyone to take responsibility. And that's when the judge allowed us in this case to tear down 2 houses on MLK last year and lien the property. So the city took the responsibility. We actually sent out public works employees to tear down the buildings and clean them off, and then we put a lien on the property so that if someone does in the future come back and claim it, there's a way for the city to get back the funds that we've spent to clean it up.
And legally that's a good process, but in some of these cases, no one's coming back. And so that becomes an issue. If the city did it continuously over and over again, we would be out quite a bit of funds without the ability to have the funds recovered. And so I think part of our challenge is then how do we get those funds back? And sometimes it's taxes. Sometimes people are failing to pay the taxes in these situations, and they could be tax deeds or tax sales. And in the past, it's gone through the county's tax commissioner, and still could if people aren't paying county taxes. They could be sold by the county tax commissioner, and now that the city's actually collecting our own taxes, that's actually a function we could do if they fail to pay city taxes. So by doing that, actually it puts it out again on the market, it becomes a productive piece of property. I think we've actually taken a proactive position the last couple of years by doing some of this demolition on these properties, because it's more likely someone's going to come in and actually purchase a piece of property that's been cleared for a potential new home, instead of actually buying a house that's dilapidated and have the concerns of is there asbestos, is there other environmental concerns. They don't want to get involved in having to do the demolition.
And the city has new tools in place as of 2017, like the Land Bank Authority. The Brunswick Land Bank Authority is an additional tool on top of what we've already been doing that allows some flexibility in moving those tax delinquent properties back into viable use. And we can talk about that a little bit later, I think.
I think we will. Let's talk a little bit about some of the cases that we've seen. And recently, I know that we do have some older homes that are slowly reaching that level, and we watch them very closely. I think we know of homes that are abandoned, but if someone moves out of a house and leaves it vacant, that doesn't mean we can jump in with code enforcement and immediately take it. If they don't paint it, or if the roof even develops a hole, that doesn't mean the house is not structural. So some folks wonder why we can't just jump on it right away. We really can until it reaches a certain level, and that's unfortunate. Because, I mean, there are property rights in this country, and some people say if I want to have a house with a hole in the roof, I'm allowed to do it. But until it becomes a potential danger or the house is no longer viable, then our building official and our process can kick in.
Now, if someone's living in the house, that's actually a different category. There are minimum standards put forth by not only the state building code, but also the city building code. So if a house is unsafe and folks are living in it, that is something that the building official can work with. But it is a challenge if someone's not living in the house for us to keep up on what properties are dilapidated versus not maintained versus needing to be torn down.
And what I think I was saying a moment ago is really that we monitor these houses and we realize somewhat when they get to that level that they've crossed the line, and we can start begin taking action.
So there is a process to stop deterioration before it gets to the point where it needs to be torn down. In the historic district, for example, we have a demolition by neglect ordinance that basically says you need to maintain your property, and just because you don't maintain it for 30 years isn't a good enough reason to tear it down. So ideally, we can get to some of those properties before they get to the point where they need to get torn down and help property owners direct them in the right way to maintain their properties and use them.
And protect historic resources too.
Exactly.
There's some people holding on to houses, whether it's financially or for sentimental reasons, whatever. It's not doing the home any good to let it decay and fall apart. It really is good to either put some action on it to save that historic home so it'll be here for generations to come.
Exactly. Houses function much better and last much longer when they have people in them using them.
Throughout some of our neighborhoods, we've found there's a number of structures that have historically burned. They may have been a minor fire in the kitchen, or they could actually have been a fire that caused damage in the attic. And even in recent years, it was not visible from the outside, but then there may have been during the storms we've had the last couple of years, the roof has collapsed, and now that's become aware that the damage is worse than we thought. A great example would probably be the old restaurant at 1311 G Street, and I think a lot of people know that intersection, or they go through it it's a good cut through to get around the light at Gloucester if you're coming down MLK. So this is the building at 1311 G. You have a photo there.
Yes, so this is the building at 1311 G. It obviously had a fire and has extensive roof damage. It probably needs to be torn down, and so our next step would be to locate the property owner. I don't think we're having much luck with that, so move on to take it to court and get a court order to tear it down.
Right. I think in that particular case there may have been like a corporate owner, and then the corporation goes out of business. Who were the corporate officers? Or then another owner might be involved. I think there is some difficulty, but then that poses a threat as the building starts to decay, especially with the fire damage. It could cause damage to the neighboring properties if something like that would collapse.
Exactly, and we do have the authority, if properties are about to collapse, to tear them down anyway in an emergency situation. But generally, when we tear them down in an emergency situation, we do not get reimbursed for the money we spent to tear down the building. And smaller buildings, obviously, may not be as costly, but larger buildings, it's a challenge we don't have a special fund set aside to tear down all the buildings in the city that need.
No, we don't. I think we really don't know what may come in a given year, so it's really difficult to budget for that. And I know that we have a number of larger buildings that we have some concerns in the city that we'd like to see come down, or we have a lot of citizens say they'd like to see them come down. In some cases, we're still hoping for the owners to take care of those structures because they still have owners on record that are still paying taxes, and so we're still pushing that those owners might do something. But in some cases, they don't. I mean, a great example would be the old Reynolds Street School, which is an old elementary school, which is just, I think it's in Newtown, as they call it, the subdivision just above Old Town. And that school has had a couple nonprofits in it after it closed as a public facility. But I think it's had recent thoughts of trying to redevelop it, but it recently had a tragedy.
It did. Unfortunately, on the second story part of that building, the roof collapsed and really did extensive damage to the building. Unfortunately, we have not been able to find a clear owner because the corporation that owned that building at 2400 Reynolds Street most recently does
dissolved.
not exist anymore. It was dissolved.
Now, it did go to court.
It did, and we are waiting for the judge issued an order that we could tear it down, but we needed to wait 30 days just to make sure there were no owners coming forward to deal with the property themselves. So we should be taking that building down, assuming that no owners come forward soon.
Now, you have some pictures of those. Can we look at those?
Yes.
Okay. So, tell us what you're looking at.
So you can see here the two-story section is in rough shape. Actually, our building official went through the entire building and has condemned the entire building. It unfortunately would just cost so much to repair this building. The building official put the repair costs at $2.5 million, and the worth of the existing building at around $30,000. So obviously not worth
the work
restoring
to
it.
do it. And I know it has brick, and it probably technically would be considered historic because I think it may have been built in the late 1940s or early 1950s. But it's truly did not have a lot of architectural value into the community, and actually the neighborhood was built probably in the 20s and 30s, so the residential neighborhood around it is actually more significant historically than the school ever was.
We are an awesome historic city, and we certainly try to save. If it's up to me, my master's is in historic preservation. I believe in historic structures. This one probably does qualify because according to the National Register of Historic Places, you need to be 50 years old to be considered historic. But you're right, it doesn't match the rest of the neighborhood in time frame. And also, it didn't have a lot of interesting architectural elements to it. Again, the cost of repair versus the cost of value is also a big determination in this case.
Okay. Well, we talked a lot about housing, but before we get off the code enforcement discussion, I'd like to talk a little bit about other things that code enforcement officers look for. To help improve our neighborhoods, part of it is also making sure our buildings are in good repair, but it's also the overall community. We see a number, especially on vacant lots, we see a number of overgrown lots occasionally, but we also see illegal dumps. How often does that happen?
Far too often.
Okay.
We see illegal dumps, and we have one code enforcement officer that really specializes, I don't want to say specializes in illegal dumps, but
She focuses.
she focuses on that. And an illegal dump is, a legal dump, to go to the other side of it, a legal dump is when you have more than what fits in your garbage can and you put it out by the road and you call Republic, who's our garbage handler, and tell them that you have a large pickup to be picked up. You can get 2 of those per year, so that's
per address.
Per address. So it's a great element that not everyone knows about. You get 2 bulk pickups per year from Republic. You do need to call about them and let them know that they're there. On the other hand, if you dump, obviously, on someone else's property or on city property, on the right of way, in an alley, in a lane.
A dead-end street.
Exactly. That's against the law, and it's a challenge for us to find the person to be held accountable. So what ends up happening
Unless
is,
they're caught in the act, and that does happen occasionally.
exactly. Certainly, if you see someone illegally dumping, give us a call. We can work on it, and that also means that we are sending out public works
Right.
employees to pick up garbage and then dispose of.
At taxpayer expense.
Exactly.
So, but when you said if you see somebody doing that, that's when you would need to call the police. It is a serious enough issue. There is a criminal charge to that.
There is.
And the police would charge. So, and that's really to help keep our community clean. And we when we came up with our new contract with Republic, we made it very clear that we wanted to see the illegal dumping stop, and that's why we primarily put in place that each customer gets 2 free pickups a year. We saw in some cases it was the landlord, and I won't say the landlord was dumping. Sometimes it may be the case that he would take the contents of the house if he threw somebody out. But in some cases they would hire a handyman to come do and to carry it off, hopefully to the dump. But what ended up happening is the handyman sometimes goes 4 blocks away and dumped it on a vacant lot. And in this case, knowing that that's there, the landlord doesn't have to pay someone 30, 40, 50 bucks to carry it away. He can call himself and get the free pickup. And then we did it 2 times a year just in case that would occur, or someone's cleaning out the garage, and that's really a mechanism that we put in place to help the landlords, the tenants, the homeowners, make sure that their debris doesn't end up being illegally dumped somewhere else in the city.
It's a great tool that homeowners and tenants can use to get big items picked up at no additional cost to them, which is awesome.
Right. Another item with code enforcement, I know it's tall grass, and that's something that now that we've come into autumn, we're not seeing as much of. Thank goodness the grass season has stopped. But we're still chasing after some of summer's grass on some of the vacant lots. And like you said, most people that are notified will take care of that. And so that does resolve a lot of issues. But junk cars, That's another question. When does a car become a junk car? Sometimes we get calls about very ugly looking cars or rusty looking cars, but they may not be junk cars.
Right. If a car is licensed and insured, it is not a junk vehicle. It can be on the street, parked legally, and it can be parked legally in your yard.
Has to operate though.
Exactly. It can't be smashed, obviously, inoperable. So sometimes it's tough to tell. Sometimes you may give us a call at code enforcement, and then we may go out and the owner shows us that it's an operable vehicle, and so that's fine. But again, license and registration are two big ones that are obvious to us. Also, extensive damage to the vehicle, which makes it inoperable. You can't have those vehicles exposed out on your property, so you could put them in a building or you could tarp them, but they can't just be sitting out, a wrecked or inoperable vehicle. And obviously, those are not vehicles that you can have on the street. The street is a public right-of-way, and so it's illegal for wrecked or inoperable vehicles to be on the street.
Good to know. Are there other areas? I know there's a lot of other minor areas of code enforcement, and I won't say they're minor. They're very important if people have the concern that code violates, but are there other issues you'd like to cover with code enforcement right at this point?
There are a bunch of codes that we look at code enforcement. Of course, I could refer the public to look at the website, but probably the best way to do it is to give us a call. Code enforcement is great at returning telephone calls. You can talk to our cell phone or our work phone, and they're in City Hall every morning, so if you leave them a message, they'll give you a call back, probably the next day. And you can ask us if you have doubts about what might be a code enforcement issue.
Okay. Well, great. I think we're going to talk about the development of the Glen Brunswick Land Bank next.
Awesome.
And we're going to have another partner join us.
Excellent.
Great. Okay, next we're going to talk about the Glen Brunswick Land Bank Authority and the City of Brunswick's participation with that, and Glen County's. But our partner that's joined us today, who works with us actually in planning and development and codes, is our planner and historic preservation officer, John Hunter. Welcome, John.
Thank you, Jim.
And it's not your first time on the program either. You've come
No, I think I was on there about a year ago.
about a year ago. We were looking at, I think, historic preservation of some of the older homes. In 2016, the City of Brunswick and Glen County and the Glen County Board of Education got together to create the Glen Brunswick Land Bank Authority. It was actually a project that we had worked on for nearly 2 years, and maybe even more, from the concept to completion, to try to bring all those partners together to put this entity in place that would allow us to address dilapidated homes, dilapidated structures, and the legal issues we talked about just a moment ago in code enforcement. And so we're really happy that we were able to get all three partners together to put this together. It's primarily the operations, because the city and the county have code enforcement operations, which are very much tied to the operations of this organization. But we thought it was very important in the creation that we had a member of the Board of Education sit on our board as well. And so it's been operational for a little more than a year, and we've got some pretty good goals in place. So the specific structure, John, I mean, the membership of the board and how it's set up, you want to tell us?
Sure. Yeah. As you mentioned, it really is a partnership between the city and county. So there are two county commissioners who are selected by the county commission to be on the board. There's two city commissioners who are appointed by the city commission to serve on the board. Then a resident of the county selected by the county, and a resident of the city selected by the city commission to serve on this body. The school board also appoints a representative as well. So we're all there, we're all participating, with it being mostly elected officials, but still having that participation from the public. So it's a nice blend of representation of all the stakeholders in our community to deal with these issues.
And I know in recruiting some of the citizen members, we were looking at people that might have some background or skill in real estate or construction, or some background that would be rather helpful to bring some skills to the board as we address some of the properties that the Land Bank Authority might acquire.
Right, and that's great expertise to have within this group, because we are dealing with essentially real estate issues. while this is a joint venture, it is an authority. So it kind of operates not on its own, but it has a very different structure than a typical city government or county government. It's kind of, when you hear authority, you think of the Downtown Development Authority or the Economic
Right.
Development Authority. So they have certain abilities to transact properties in a little bit different way than the regular government entities do. So,
Right.
it,
And that's due to the law. The law actually
Right.
allows such an authority to have different abilities to.
right, and one of the reasons this
To
has come
transact real
about
estate,
is land banks have actually been legal in Georgia for a number of years, dating back into the early 1980s, but they weren't taken advantage of. And there were some changes in the legislation in the early 2000s to early 2010s that really expanded the powers of land banks to tackle these issues with blight and dilapidated structures and unpaid taxes in municipalities. One of the unique things about it, about the Georgia law, is that it actually requires, if not a partnership between your city and county government, you have to, if the city wanted to do a land bank on their own, the county would actually have to agree specifically that this could take place. And
Right.
so what the state was trying to do was really build these community-wide partners who are dealing with this broad issue of tax deeded properties and blight, and really have good community representation within the organizations.
And it took us a while to build that partnership. I think the city was on board with it early on because we saw the need in our community, that we saw the blight, we saw some of the abandoned buildings, and that we really saw the challenges that Bren and I talked about a little while ago with the heirs properties, properties that hadn't paid taxes, and the people didn't want to buy because they had to pay the past taxes, and it didn't even exceeded the value of the land. So it's a bad business deal. So the properties just stayed out there for almost decades.
Well, right, and that's exactly the type property that the land bank is really set up to deal with. You have these long-standing dilapidated properties, or they could just be vacant lots.
Mhm.
That's one of the things we're finding around the city is that because the population has changed over the years from its peak, we're off maybe about 10,000 residents off of what peak population was in the 1960s. You may have had a house that was torn down 20 years ago, and that lot has been vacant, and 10 years ago, the owner died, and there were no
Right.
heirs. So that vacant lot could be contributing to redeveloping in, parts of the city, but there's nobody to sell it.
Right, and so I think technically by definition, neighborhoods that are sporadically checkered with vacant lots are considered blighted, even if the lots are mowed.
You're right. There are a lot of studies out there that point to vacant lots and overgrown lots immediately contributing to decreases in land value and increases in different, in particular, code enforcement issues like illegal dumping and just general neglect in neighborhoods, and that it has a real negative impact. So if you can tackle those vacant lots, all of a sudden you've taken care of these challenges. Now, when you turn to buildings, you've got a very different situation because, like you said, a lot of times the building's dilapidated. There's a cost to tearing that down. The property, if it's got 5 or 6 years of unpaid taxes on it, that adds up really quickly. So if we did what we normally would have done, which is traditionally lien that property for the demolition costs, all of a sudden a vacant lot that may be worth $5,000 has $15,000 worth of liens against it.
Right.
So there's no incentive for anybody to do anything. The land bank has the unique ability to abate the outstanding taxes. So this property that has 5 or 6 years of unpaid taxes on it, that gets wiped away.
Right.
And so you can start from scratch, or at least a lower amount of investment to get the property back going again. And that's really the real power of the land bank is dealing with those tax issues. You also have the ability to deal with the title issues that not a lot of entities can deal with. So these heirs issues or these just
Right.
Basically dead-end ownership issues, the land bank has the ability to go out and get a clear title, take care of the back taxes, and put this back out on the market so that they're viable properties again.
When you say other entities couldn't do it, actually the formal city government and the formal county government did not have that ability under state law.
Right.
So this partnership really opens up the door to greater investment for people to come back and invest in the properties. I know when we were studying it and looking at it, some of the earlier examples that you would see, like at the city of Detroit, there were people who did very good job taking care of their homes, but little by little, homes in their neighborhood or their block were torn down. And you would see entire blocks of 1 or 2 houses remaining in the city of Detroit. It actually mowed and cleared the properties, but it became almost like a bombed out area in Europe, say after World War II, where you had very few homes surviving and it really wasn't a viable neighborhood. What was once probably a very close group of citizens interacting, it had all the culture of a neighborhood was gone. And I think that's what our fear is, that in some parts of our city we were starting to see that, and that's why we needed to really act and put something together. The point about the taxes, and I think that was probably one of our hardest things to get across to our Board of Education and to our county commission is, why do we want a board that's going to forgive the taxes? We want those past taxes. We're going to lose the revenue. And I think the true point that we were able to get across to county commissioners to get them to come on board with us, since we were trying to do that for a couple of years, was that the small amount of taxes that you would bring in on a vacant lot that's $5,000 in value, compared to a lot that someone may now buy and build a home on, financially you're better off if you would let this happen, let someone come in, buy the property, build a home. You're going to actually collect more taxes in the long run than you will for the vacant lot if someone ever shows up to pay the back taxes.
And John touched on it already. If a property has $30,000 of back taxes on it and the property is only worth $10,000, the chances of getting somebody to go in and pay the $10,000 and then pay off the $30,000 of property taxes are slim.
Right.
This gives us the ability to market it to a different buyer who's able to then move forward with the property quickly.
Well, and there's also other opportunities. There may be instances where we're not actually dealing with buildings that need to be demolished.
Okay.
There are properties that our research has already shown that people haven't paid taxes on in 5 or 10 years, and no one's living in them. But if you go into the actual property, it's a sound house. So the land bank can work very creatively to get that property into the hands of somebody who's willing to renovate the house. If it's a historic home, they can restore it.
Mm-hmm.
That adds more value as well to these neighborhoods. So you're not only taking care of the vacant lots and the dilapidated structures, you're helping to rescue these houses that we were talking about earlier that may have almost gotten to that point of needing to be demolished, but now all of a sudden new life is breathed into them.
And that may have happened just because there was an owner that had no heirs, passed away, and then perhaps the taxes got so high it surpassed the value of the house.
Exactly.
Like you said, they're still in good shape, some of these homes.
Right.
And some houses were built so well that they can withstand being vacant for a while. In fact, some of the properties out there have trees and brush that have grown up around it, and while it doesn't look good and we're trying to work on those, often those trees protect the property. So you'd be surprised at how many houses out there can actually be restored and have good bones to them.
And I think that's a goal of the city. Now, John, when your predecessor in your position actually was titled Demolition Manager, and
right.
probably a decade ago, the city was looking at what can we do to tear down and demolish, and that's really not been the direction of the city today.
Right, and that's actually something I think was a little bit of a learning process with the city. Starting about 10 years ago, 2007, 2008, the city really made a very aggressive effort to partner with the community to tear down a number of these properties. They tore down over between 2007, 2008 up through 2015, well over 200 properties around the city. But what we saw happening with that was then there was nobody there to take responsibility for the properties. And so you ended up with vacant lots. And while a vacant lot is safer than a dilapidated, falling down building, you haven't solved all your code enforcement issues. And out of those 200 or so properties that were torn down, not only did they become vacant lots, many times the property owner basically walked away from it. They didn't have anything invested in it anymore. So now those 200 properties, you've got unpaid taxes on them, you've got code enforcement issues on them. So this is a little bit more flexible way in using the land bank to actually really solve the issue beyond just demolition. And we're excited about the potential here.
And if I can touch for a second, go back to code enforcement, to echo what John just said. If you have a property in your neighborhood that was vacant and you're seeing now vagrants and questionable activity in that house, please give the police a call, give code enforcement a call. We can do something about those properties so that they're not damaged anymore, but the building is secured, and then we can move forward on what we can do with it.
And we talked about saving houses, but absolutely, there are houses that have reached the condition that still need to be demolished.
Right.
And we're going to act on that. But I like what you're saying. The point is really traditional code enforcement, whether it's the city's code enforcement or the county's code enforcement, can get to the point of tear down and clear the lot. And then as a governmental entity, we can check the box and say we've done our job. But this takes it a step further because we're not rebuilding community, and that's what we're hoping to do. Like the neighborhood I mentioned in Detroit, it's lost community. If we can rebuild the community and rebuild those missing houses, then we've really truly repaired and healed our city.
Well, and we've got a great opportunity within the land bank for partnerships as well. That's one of the things that's really built into it, where organizations who are focused in community redevelopment, nonprofits, they have an opportunity to acquire these lands in some cases and at very, very inexpensive rates. To then come in and build new housing stock, whether that's designed to be for low to moderate incomes or for middle incomes, or it provides a great tool to incentivize redevelopment and won't say giving away land, but really taking into account all the factors going on at the particular location and how best to energize the neighborhood and rebuild it.
Well, and when you mentioned the partners, and though we're just getting it off the ground, we know that we've identified some partners. And looking at other land banks across the country, I mean, one of the main partners could be Habitat for Humanity, because they come in and will build and put an affordable home in for families. Rebuilding America, and I know we have a group here in Brunswick, Rebuilding Glen. It could be a private developer. We may actually work with a developer who wants to acquire a certain number of lots, and we partner with them that they will build on a lot perhaps owned by the land bank, and then in the sale we would receive some amount back, as would they. It's a good way to rebuild. We talked about residential, but commercial is also a factor.
Yeah, it is. It's commercial is not immune from these same issues, and in some cases, it may be because there are some sort of issues just beyond kind of abandonment. You may have an old gas station location that's got buried tanks underground or something like that nobody wants to deal with. Those are typically looked at from a brownfields perspective.
Okay. You're coming up with a difficult one.
Yeah. So,
Okay.
you have this situation where there's a legitimate issue with the property, like a buried gas tank, and the owner walked away from it and said, nope, I'm not going to deal with this. And they've dissolved their LLC, and no one's responsible, and the taxes have built up. You know, before, you know that this issue was there, but the city would really have no way to deal with it. It just is going to sit there for forever. We actually have a couple of those along the Norwich Street corridor.
Okay.
Through the land bank. The land bank would be able to work on the city's behalf and acquire that property, clean up the title, take care of the tax issue. Now that makes it much easier to apply to get funding from the Environmental Protection Division of Georgia DNR to get money to clean up that buried gas tank underground. Whereas before you couldn't, it was just going to sit there.
Okay.
So, you know, it really does provide some great flexibility in how you can take care of multiple types of issues around the city and the county.
There's transitional areas as well.
Right.
You have, and you see that historically, that you have streets that were but once single lane roads and residential houses, and now they've actually transitioned to commercial. Maybe the road was widened. I know that we've talked about trying to maybe piece together blocks that were traditionally residential and maybe redevelop them as commercial.
Right, and you know, this
In fact, Norwich Street comes to mind.
Norwich Street comes to mind. There are probably some areas along MLK that would fit inside that category, where you know, that impact of that road widening or that change in transition from commercial to or residential to commercial. You know, people just decided not to live in that area anymore.
Right.
So you're right. You can assemble blocks. You know, that's one of the things that the Land Bank Board is looking closely at. We're not just dealing with a couple of properties here and there. Unfortunately, one of the things that we're dealing with in Brunswick is a fairly extensive list of a combination of dilapidated properties and these properties that have outstanding tax deeds. And so how do you best prioritize your action as you move forward? We've got a list of well over 200 properties that we've identified within the city that fit into one of these categories. So, you know, it's going to be really important as the land bank moves forward to look at areas where they can have the greatest impact, not only from a housing standpoint, but other things that are going on around it. So where are key areas that other government investment is going in that if you, a great example is the area around Burroughs Millette. That's one area that the land bank has looked at for focus, and we actually have a code enforcement focus in that area right now. Burroughs Millette is an old elementary school being replaced with a new elementary school.
Right.
You have that great investment by the Board of Education in that community, so it makes sense for us to start looking at, well, right across the street, we've got 3 dilapidated houses. Is there something the land bank can do to take care of that? So all of a sudden, that block is re-energized because you're right next to a brand new elementary school, and it has a domino effect throughout that community through that investment.
And the other communities that we're looking at, we're kind of doing a comprehensive push on code enforcement with the land bank, are the areas surrounding the Glen Academy and the Arco neighborhood in the county. The county has teamed up with the land bank as well in their code enforcement push, and hopefully we'll see those 3 neighborhoods start to see a bigger impact.
And that's a good point, because we talk a lot about the city, and we are the city of Brunswick, but we do have that partner in Glenn County. We work with county code enforcement, and I think that was also part of the realization of our county commission when they came on as join us as a partner. They realized they had an issue too. It's not everything just inside the city limits. I think they came to understand that in Arco, just outside of the city to the north, or even in other parts of the county, that they're finding their abandoned homes, whether they were taken for mortgage, you know, in the mortgage crisis, or it was taken for taxes, or again, it could be an heir's property. There just was not an heir to take the home, and there's legal issues. So there are issues around the county, and we've even found them on St. Simon's Island, which is surprising to many people. So we were not just focusing on the city, we're focusing on the entire county as a land bank. And I know we're very involved in the land bank ourselves, and so we still have that city hat on, but we also put on that countywide land bank hat when we're working on these issues.
Right.
The Land Bank Authority Board is chaired by our city commissioner, Commissioner Harris, and she and our board are working forward on a number of projects. And probably one of the ones we're looking at right now, we've acquired some lands that were vacant lands from the city and the county, but the 1315 Union Street project, would you kind of get into that and talk a little bit? It's really a fun project because it was a donation to the city of an old historic home.
Sure. 1315 Union Street is a property that's really hasn't been occupied for almost 20 years.
Okay.
It went under renovation about 10 years ago, and the owner wasn't able to accomplish renovating the house. It ended up being foreclosed on by the previous owner. It was kind of a self-financing deal. And it's really a beautiful home. It's about 4,300 square feet. It's 2 stories. It was built in about 1890, and it's what's called a Barber house. Barber was an architect that you could order plans from. You had a catalog, and you had a book, and you had pretty pictures of it. And you'd look at it and say, oh, I want to order these plans, and you'd order the plans, and they'd arrive, and your local builder would construct it. And so it's got, it's actually one of just a handful of those within Brunswick. So it's always had kind of a special place within the preservation community of Brunswick. In 2015, the owner came forward with a demolition permit application, and myself and our building inspector at the time did a full assessment of the building and determined that while it's been gutted, and yes, it's in pretty rough shape, the building itself is actually sound. It doesn't have really foundation issues, but the actual cost of rehabbing the building is incredibly great. It's probably in the neighborhood of $350,000. And land values and building values being what they are, the numbers don't always play out right. And
So basically it cost more to renovate than it would
be worth, right.
Right.
And so the owner actually ended up deeding the property over to the city, and the land bank identified that as a potential house to save through renovation, but also, frankly, as a little bit of a way to get some seed money into the land bank to help fulfill some of its functions. And so the city has transferred that property to the land bank. We are in the process of getting that on the market right now. And we're going to be partnering with the Georgia Trust for Historic Preservation to market this property.
And the board just took the action to move forward with that. So I think,
Right.
and they seem very proud of that. I think they're really
Yeah, they are.
exciting.
You know, it is saving really kind of a landmark property within the city that was threatened. Hopefully, we'll be able to attract a person to invest in that property, and it's got some flexibility. It happens to be zoned so that it could actually be commercial or residential.
right.
And
It's right there across from the Baptist
it's
church.
right adjacent to the Baptist church, and it's a really cool house. When we have the opportunity to go through it, you can really envision how this was really a grand home at one time. It was broken up into apartments in the 1940s, and then was turned into
Offices?
an architect's
Okay.
office in the 1970s. So it's got some unusual things going on in it, but it's got potential. And so hopefully we're going to be able to attract somebody who sees that potential as well. And, that'll be a great kind of model home for this is what the land bank is able to do.
And maybe I need to clarify my statement earlier saying it cost more to renovate than it was worth. It costs more to renovate if you pay the higher market price for it and then have to do the renovation. I think by getting the donation, we're able to sell it at a reasonable amount that someone could come in and actually restore
And
it.
it also has the opportunity, too, to potentially take advantage of historic preservation tax credits that are available through the state of Georgia and also at the federal level that can help even out those costs as well. And so there really is some great potential there for investment in our community.
Wonderful. Well, I want to thank you both for being on the program today to talk about code enforcement and talk about the steps that the city and the county are taking to clean up some of these blighted areas that we have in our jurisdictions. So thanks.
Thank you,
Thanks
Jim.
so much for having us.
Today we learned about initiatives that the City of Brunswick is taking to clean up our community. Whether it's code enforcement and illegal dumps or it's how to take care of some of our blighted homes in some of the neighborhoods that we have. We're focusing on the whole city, but we're looking at neighborhoods, neighborhood by neighborhood, and we're going to make a difference. But for more information about the programs, please check the City of Brunswick website. We look forward to our next program, and we'll hope you'll join us then.
Hi, this is Matthew Hill with the Brunswick Downtown Development Authority. According to our most recent Facebook poll, the top 5 events in Brunswick this October are: number 1, Slow Food Coastal Georgia Harvest Festival, Friday, October the 12th from 5 to 9 p.m. at Mary Ross Waterfront Park. Celebrate the bounty of food along the Georgia coast through this inaugural festival that brings the community together with good food and fun. Number 2, Coast Fest, Saturday, October the 6th, 10 a.m. to 4 p.m. at Mary Ross Waterfront Park, Georgia's largest celebration of our state's coastal natural resources. Over 70 environmental, educational, and resource organizations from around the Southeast will offer visitors a chance to learn about Georgia's coastal resources and have fun at the same time. Number 3, Trunk or Treat, Wednesday, October 31st, 5:30 to 7:30 p.m. in historic downtown Brunswick. Fun activities for kids of all ages. Number 4, First Friday, October the 5th from 5 to 8 p.m. in historic downtown Brunswick. See old friends and meet new ones at this monthly community event downtown. Shop at our downtown stores, check out the latest at the Ritz Theater, and grab a bite and quench your thirst at one of our restaurants. Number 5, Boo Bash, Saturday, October the 20th from 8 a.m. to 3 p.m. at Mary Ross Waterfront Park. A spectacular car show benefiting local car enthusiast Lisa Johnson. Other events this month include Shame the Devil, an audience with Fanny Kemble, October 6th and 7th at the Ritz Theater. An entertaining look at the 19th century actress who spent time on St. Simon's Island. Rhythm on the River, Sunday, October the 7th from 6 to 8 p.m. at Mary Ross Waterfront Park. This month featuring the Blind Spots. Bring your chair or blanket, a picnic, and your favorite beverage to this free community concert. And Soul Dance in Breakin' Backward, October the 20th, 8 p.m. at the Ritz Theater. See Houston-based Soul Street Dance, one of the most dynamic dance companies in existence.